Easy Explain Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill, Chapter 5. So here we're going to look at the connection between justice and utility. Right, so taking this ethical standard we've set with the utilitarian ends, putting happiness as the greatest and most desirable end to our actions for ourselves and others, and now we're going to tie this into justice. We're going to start looking back at Mill's political theory a little bit, where he got his start with liberty and justice in connection to liberty. So first, let's consider the etymology of justice. Where does this word come from? So this is an interesting dive that Mill starts with. He says, if not in all languages, the etymology of the word which corresponds to just points directly to an origin connected with the ordinances of law. Justum is a form of justum, that which has been ordered, right? Your laws are your orders. Recht in German, which came from right and righteous, is synonymous with law. The courts of justice, the administration of justice, are the court and the administration of law. La justice in French is the established term for judicature. Etymology is slight evidence of what the idea now signified is, but the very best evidence of how it sprang up. There can, I think, be no doubt the idea mère, the mother idea, the founding idea, the primitive element in the formation of the gnosis of justice was conformity to law. So here Mill is just taking this connection. He's looking at a few different languages. That justice is connected to law. It's what should be ordered. It's what should be happening. So now that we have that in our back pocket, let's really quickly just go back and refresh on some things that Mill has already said on Kant and the pre-standing, very popular moral theory that Mill was working at the time. So back in chapter 1, Mill summed up Kant's theory as, so act that the rule on which thou actest would admit of being adopted as a law by all rational beings, right? Going back to this idea of Kant's, of the universal moral law. In chapter 2, we saw Mill start to argue against this a little bit. In chapter 2, he said there is no case of moral obligation in which some secondary principle is not involved. And if only one, there can seldom be any real doubt which one it is in the mind of any person by whom the principle itself is recognized. So in here in chapter 2, Mill started to get at that maybe Kant didn't have the full consideration, right? It's sure, you can say one thing, but there's always going to be another level to that. And that's where Mill starts to propose that, maybe Kant didn't get the full picture, maybe he was wrong. And that will bring us here to what he says about chapter 5, where he's starting to say, well, maybe this is actually what Kant meant, right? You can take Kant in this way. So Mill says, to give any meaning to Kant's principle, the sense put upon it must be that we ought to shape our conduct by a rule which all rational beings might adopt, which with benefit to their collective interest. So here Mill is saying that no matter what you're doing within a Kantian moral duty kind of standpoint and sense, no matter what you're doing, everything that's being considered here is the collective interest of mankind, right? And for Mill, that's happiness, right? So he's saying even Kant was a utilitarian in this sense of trying to strive for the greatest possible happiness for the greatest amount of living things. So let's jump to a connection here. In chapter 5, Mill goes on to say, it appears from what has been said that justice is a name for certain moral requirements, which regarded collectively stand higher in the scale of social utility. Here we go. And therefore of more paramount obligation than any others. Though particular cases may occur in which some other social duty is so important as to overrule any one of the greatest maxims of justice. So what Mill is doing here is that he's saying, we look at justice in light of these moral lights, that sure, there's a duty to certain things, and most of the time that's going to yield the greatest possible happiness, that's going to yield the greatest amount of social utility. But sure, in the court of law, looking at justice as a large, sometimes there's going to be very niche, very particular cases where this isn't always the case, and that's why we have judges, right? We're going to have to actually figure this out and use our best judgment. But for the most part, we can address justice with utilitarianism in mind. So let's just do a big conclusion here on justice and utility. Kant sums up by saying that justice remains the appropriate name for certain social utilities which are vastly more important and therefore more absolute and imperative than any others are as a class, though not more so than others may be in particular cases, and which therefore ought to be, as well as naturally are, guarded by a sentiment not only different in degree, but also in kind, distinguished from the milder feeling which attaches to the mere idea of promoting human pleasure or convenience, at once by the more definite nature of its commands and by the sterner character of its sanctions. I think that's a great place to end, really sum this up. We're summing up utilitarianism as a response to Kantian ethics. We're summing it up in terms of the greatest happiness principle. We're connecting it back to justice and how, this can really be our guiding light, especially even when it comes to the law. So that's chapter 5 in a nutshell. That concludes utilitarianism. Next, we're going to start looking at how he applies this to his his feminist standpoint theory, looking at the subjection of women. But for now, hope this helps.